Jackson Pollock is just about as famous as artists get. He rose from obscurity in the 1940s to international fame in the 1950s. Pollock became famous not just for the paintings he made, but also for the innovative way in which he made them. To really get Pollock requires understanding not just his radical process, but also all the hype and mythologizing that surrounded his career. Pollock rose to fame in an era when art seemed to matter. This was also a time when America was mythologizing itself, the American dream, suburban life, American prosperity. Yes, Pollock's art was controversial, but he was lauded by art critics, and his paintings were bought by prominent art collectors and prestigious museums. He quickly became synonymous with American art and really American freedom itself in the 1950s. Pollock was part of an avant-garde American art movement called abstract expressionism. Radical, large-scale paintings made purely of color, shape, and texture. And Pollock's paintings were particularly radical, not just because of what he put on the canvas, but also because of his radical, seemingly unhinged creative process. Pollock created his so-called drip paintings by moving around the canvas in a kind of dance, dripping and flinging paint. We can think about this whole process of making a painting as a kind of performance, and the painting itself as a recording of the performance. All his actions were in a sense recorded on the canvas in paint. This process was aptly referred to as the record of the dance, and the style of painting was aptly called action painting. Many of Pollock's paintings had heavy textures built from thick layers of paint and included objects like cigarette butts and even sand, taking inspiration from Native American colored sandstone painting. Like a jazz player, Pollock worked intuitively, improvising as he moved around the canvas. We might even say that deep or hidden elements of Pollock's personality were captured in the paint. This might sound like a stretch, but the abstract expressionists were very influenced by European surrealists and the psychoanalytic concept of the unconscious mind. The surrealists were enamored with the process of free association, like what analysts do with ink blots, but also the power of dreams to unlock the deep mysteries of the mind. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung's theories were still immensely influential in the 1950s, and it's helpful to frame Pollock's work in the context of Freud and Jung's cultural impact. Like the Greek philosopher Aristotle, Freud and Jung believed that creating art is a cathartic process, that the soul could be purged by making art.
The modern artist, it seems to me, is working and expressing an inner world. In other words, expressing the energy, the motion, and other inner forces.
Pollock had undergone Jungian therapy for alcoholism, and he continued to be a follower of Jung until his death in 1956. Jung believed that humans had become disconnected with their primitive unconscious. And in a sense, Pollock's art is an attempt to channel this kind of primal energy that, according to Jung, was ancient in origin. So we might even imagine that Pollock's art represents the raw energy of the psyche. His paintings are like impenetrable labyrinths. They're like riddles without solutions. And they have a clear connection to the automatic drawings of André Masson, drawings that attempt to express the subconscious by abandoning rational thought. During the middle of the 1940s, Pollock's paintings transitioned into pure abstraction. But his early paintings were figurative, and they looked more like the abstractions of Pablo Picasso. Pollock explored the mythological with she-wolf and mask. In Guardians of the Secret, we see Pollock's exploration of ancient, mystical imagery. We start to see a clear evolution towards the iconic drip paintings, both in terms of style and subject matter. Pollock's approach is unplanned, brutal, and immediate. He was abandoning the careful and deliberate approach of European masters. Appreciating art often involves believing in the world the artist has created. This is a choice the viewer can make to allow their minds to fall into the painting, to fall into the world of the artist. Now you may be thinking, that's all very interesting, but what does this have to do with Jackson Pollock becoming a symbol of freedom? Well, by the 1950s, Jackson Pollock had become America's most famous painter. He had a full spread in Life magazine, and his paintings sold for more than many Americans made in a year. The success of abstract expressionism as a whole helped to establish New York City as the new center of the art world. Pollock was one of the leading forces behind abstract expressionism, a movement that was completely American. And so Pollock came to be seen as a standard bearer for cutting-edge American art. With the help of liberal but also anti-communist art critics like Clement Greenberg and Harold Rosenberg, abstract expressionism was interpreted as symbolic of American freedom and individualism. especially in contrast with Soviet art of the time, which was restricted to realistic depictions of Soviet life that upheld Communist Party values. Pollock's unchained approach could easily be seen as a product of Western liberty, where artists were free to paint, experiment, and even offend public tastes. In the simplest terms, American art symbolized freedom. Soviet art symbolized totalitarianism. And because all the different members of the abstract expressionist movement expressed themselves in such unique and individualistic ways, the entire movement could be seen as embodying the American spirit and American exceptionalism. In his seminal essay, The American Action Painters, Harold Rosenberg described the abstract expressionist as a vanguard painter who took to the wide expanse of the canvas as Melville's Ishmael took to the sea. In the public consciousness, the art came to represent pure possibility, and no one benefited more from this myth-making than Jackson Pollock. Rosenberg gave the abstract expressionist a soul. He defined a will to power. The act of painting itself could be transcendent and transformative. Looking back to the 19th century, Impressionist painters like Renoir and Monet were more interested in capturing the mood or impression of a scene than trying to achieve photorealism. So Pollock and the abstract expressionists, they took this idea to its logical end. Pollock's drip paintings are pure mood, pure expression. Instead of capturing an experience, the painting was the beginning and the end, the experience itself. Pollock's freewheeling, paint-flinging, performative approach changed the way artists thought about the creative process. Pollock made the process part of the art. His unbound style of painting even changed the way painters thought about the canvas. Pollock ignored the frame of the canvas itself, sending paint flying off the edges. What greater metaphor is there for artistic freedom? And in the broader context of the Cold War, it was no small thing that the most influential living painter in the 1950s was American. The US and the Soviet Union were fighting for dominance, and cultural achievements were just as important as military wins. The Cold War was not just about who had the bigger guns, but whose ideas were better. Pollock's radical and expressive style captured the zeitgeist of 1950s America and became symbolic of life in the free world. Pollock's paintings were extremely divisive in the 1940s and 1950s for artists, art critics, and the public. People argued about whether Pollock was the destroyer of art or the liberator. Americans at the time could barely stomach the art of Picasso and Matisse, so when Jackson Pollock came along, he seemed ludicrous. But in many ways, Pollock is famous for being a lightning rod. He's famous for the ways in which his paintings and persona have been mythologized. Mountains of literature have been written about Pollock, connecting him with romantic American ideals. Pollock has been described as a masculine, rugged, rough and tumble, artistic pioneer, his paintings as raw and expansive, just like the myth of the New World. Pollock's paintings became emblematic of America and the individual spirit, emblematic of artistic creation. Of course, Pollock's approach to painting was more considered than pop culture gave him credit for, and much of Pollock's reputation as a wild man was due to his alcoholism, not his burning creative spirit. And his untimely death at 44 allowed his reputation to grow unfettered. So then, was Pollock overhyped? Sure, in the same way that most famous figures are. Pollock was sucked into the culture machine and spit out the other side. Ironically, Pollock didn't seek out publicity, but he did demonstrate a path to fame for other artists of the time. There's a trap of wanting to compare Pollock to the masters of the past, or to appraise Pollock's paintings as discrete works of art, disregarding their authorship, subject matter, and cultural impact. But to do this is to misunderstand what art is, especially in the 20th century. Pollock's paintings and persona resonated with broader themes of mid-century American life. People can disagree about whether Pollock actually embodied the American spirit, or whether Carl Jung's theories are bunk, or whether Edward Hopper was a more technically skilled draftsman than Pollock. But to try to rate art in absence of its context doesn't make much sense. To try to rate art in general is problematic. Is Pollock's Blue Poles better art than Peter Paul Rubens' Massacre of the Innocents? It's like wondering whether Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone is better music than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Even if you were able to successfully argue that Jackson Pollock was overhyped in the 1950s, even if you could tear down the myth of Jackson Pollock, the heroic painter, it wouldn't change the impact Pollock had on art in the 20th century. Pollock made even the most radical European artists look like yesterday's news. And so in this way, Jackson Pollock has become part of the story of art.